This episode discusses crime scenes, murder, and autopsy. Listener discretion is advised. This is The Fall Line. We've brought you to Nashville before. Recently, we told you about Ricky Franks, who disappeared in 1985, just before the annual fanfare. And you've also heard the story of Lorian Nicholson, an 18-year-old who also went missing in Music City just before a major event. Lorian's disappearance occurred on April 12, 1998. That was just a few days before a historic series of tornadoes ripped through Tennessee on the 15th and 16th of that month. And Nashville was not spared. That devastation overshadowed the discovery of an unidentified male victim found on April 13th. The story of that homicide victim, who was found rolled inside a burning carpet on a dead-end road, was disturbing. It caught the attention of local news at first. But after the tornado hit Nashville, coverage of the unidentified man disappeared. The unidentified male, found just one day after Lorian Nicholson disappeared, was never connected to the missing teenager. That's because he'd been erroneously reported as found. Someone had called the police station to say he'd returned. Not anyone in his family, mind you. You can hear that story on our 3-episode series on his case. But the missing persons report was closed, and Lorian was not compared to the John Doe victim. A connection wasn't made until 2012 when his sisters used NamUs to search for unidentified persons in Tennessee. And in 2013, that John Doe victim found on the road in Nashville was identified as their brother, but whoever killed him remains at large. Lorian was not the only long-term unidentified person to be found in Nashville. Now, any big city has Doe cases that wait a long time to be solved. And now, Detective Matthew Filter of the Metro Nashville Police Department hopes that collaborating with the public will help him solve some of Nashville's oldest Doe cases. Detective Filter worked with us to bring you Ricky's case, and because of that connection, we'll be sharing a number of other Tennessee cases with you. First up are 2 unidentified women, one found in 1976 and the other in 1998, just about a month before Lorian Nicholson disappeared. Each of these cases has been known by different names, official and unofficial, and have a few key details in common. Both victims were found in local bodies of water, the Harpeth River and the Cumberland River, and they were found soon after death with recognizable features. Extremely accurate forensic art was produced in each case, and both victims were seen by witnesses who could describe the circumstances before their deaths. In many situations, this would be enough to identify them. But it hasn't been. Not yet, but we believe that can change. With your help. We start in 1998. A month before Lorian's disappearance. Not that these events have any connection that we know of, but it gives us a little bit of insight into what was happening in Nashville at that time. When we looked into Lorian's case, we took a look at Nashville's crime statistics in 1998. The mid to late 1990s were hard on the city, with the decade's all-time murder rate highs coming in 1995 and 1997. 1998 wasn't as bad, but the numbers were still significant. The Department of Health recorded 99 homicides in the city that year. One of those is an unidentified woman who's known to some as the Cumberland River Jane Doe, or as Nashville Jane Doe 1998. But perhaps she's best known by the nickname Leo Jane Doe. On March 18, 1998, a barge driver made a call. Something was floating out on the Cumberland River. A deckhand on the boat had spotted a figure in the water and alerted the others. According to Metro Nashville police reports, it was a few minutes before 8 in the morning when the call came about what appeared to be a person, face down, quote, floating west in the Cumberland River at the 179-mile marker. The operator called in this information, stating that what he saw appeared to be a deceased person, partially unclothed, floating face down in the water. Per Metro Nashville police records, a number of personnel were dispatched to the scene, including police officers, members of the rescue squad, and a medical examiner. Based on outside reporting, the rescue squad is a bi-county volunteer group that provides a variety of emergency assistance from transport to life-saving measures. They arrived at an area of the river called Cleese's Ferry Boat Ramp, a name derived from the Clee brothers, who founded one of the city's many ferries. At one time, Nashville depended on its boats. And shut down since 1990, the ramp still made a good landmark. So was the other important location mentioned in the report, Hunter's or Rock Harbor Marina at mile marker 175. When you're on land, trying to reach a recovery scene on water, you need all the help you can get. When the team made it to the Cumberland River site, they spotted the victim near those landmarks. Her body was recovered from the water and brought to shore. The earliest notations in the case state that the victim was, quote, Hispanic, and, quote, appeared to have suffered 2 gunshot wounds to the head and face. That notation, that the victim was Hispanic or possibly Hispanic, would appear on and off for years in media and various databases. More than 2 decades later, when investigative genetic genealogy began in her case, testing showed that she was of non-Hispanic European ancestry. Those earlier notations didn't affect the missing persons who were compared to Leo Jane Doe, but now that more advanced information may help a family better recognize their missing loved one. On the night of March 18, 1998, and in the following days, the initial investigators only had the information they could gather at the scene and what the autopsy and late 90s testing could tell them. Some of the earliest details pertain to Leo Jane Doe's physical appearance. The initial case notes tell us that she appeared to be middle-aged with light hair and green or hazel eyes. Her age range would be amended a few times, with the estimates falling anywhere between 30 to 55. Eventually, experts settled on somewhere between 45 and 55 years old. Leo Jane Doe's hair was later described in a more detailed way, as light brown and wavy, with blonde highlighting or streaks. Her nails seemed freshly manicured and well-kempt with French tips. She was around 5'2" and weighed about 167 pounds at recovery. She was dressed in black nylon pants that featured a distinctive Tweety Bird emblem. As the barge operator had noted, she had no shirt and a single white Reebok sneaker. However, she was wearing 2 rings and a necklace, and the necklace stood out, even in the earliest reports. It was a small gold medallion, a charm, marked with the words, Leo, July 24th to August 23rd. It was emblazoned with a stylized lion and hung on a gold chain. It was so distinctive and memorable that it became her namesake, Leo Jane Doe. She'd also worn both her rings on the right middle finger, stacked, 1 silver and 1 black, probably onyx, investigators noted in the report. But remember her necklace. It's the kind of thing that people noticed. When Leo Jane Doe was examined during autopsy, the medical examiner confirmed that her cause of death was 2 gunshot wounds. She hadn't been placed in the Cumberland River until after her death. Likely, she'd only been there a few hours. According to her autopsy report, Leo Jane Doe had been in good health at the time of her death. She had no drugs or alcohol in her system. The medical examiner noted, quote, slight lactational changes to her breasts, perhaps signaling at least 1 previous childbirth, but we'd never come across any notation like that before in a report, so we reached out to an expert for an opinion. When I spoke with a medical examiner who's close to our show, they told me it would be difficult to make a substantive ruling on a possible previous lactation or pregnancy based on this description without having a microscopic exam, especially in someone who, ostensibly, would have given birth years before the examination. It's not indicated that any internal examination was done, and the changes that breast experienced during pregnancy and lactation can be mirrored by other shifts in the body, such as quick growth or weight loss or gain, medications, or other factors. Based on that, we wouldn't consider there to be any definite indicators that Leo Jane Doe had or had not given birth. What is definite is the expense and attention paid to Leo Jane Doe's teeth. Her file notes that she had extensive and high-quality dental work. Per MNPD records, about $10,000 to $14,000 worth of repair. And today, that would be roughly $18,000 to $26,000, something that might suggest a background of means or excellent insurance. Law enforcement told the Tennessean that their search of the river would expand beyond the direct area where the Leo Jane Doe was found. They searched nearby overpasses, the shores, and the areas where it would be feasible to drop a body into the water, especially without much notice. NMPD also contacted the FBI to have Leo Jane Doe's prints run, but per their records, the quality of the prints was poor. Though the FBI was able to input them into their systems for classification, they reported no hits. Teletypes were sent out to, quote, all receiving agencies with forensic images, but they didn't receive any responses that positively matched Leo Jane Doe. Meanwhile, the city was canvassed. Hotels and short-term residencies were checked, and news outlets shared the details of Leo Jane Doe's description. And that did bring in an important bit of information, something that seemed to, at least, place her and a possible person of interest in a timeline, and witnesses who saw her before her death. It was her necklace that did it. According to the Tennessean, quote, a convenience store clerk may have seen her on Music Valley Drive sometime on Tuesday night, and that was March 17th, the night before she was found. That's an area of town near the Opryland Hotel and not far from the river where she was recovered. According to that witness, Leo Jane Doe was on Music Valley Drive that night, strolling through the area. She was wearing the same Tweety Bird pants she'd been dressed in at recovery. The clerk noted them. After all, Leo Jane Doe had also been wearing a t-shirt that matched, emblazoned with Tweety Bird. And that night, she hadn't been alone. She was accompanied by a man. Per the Tennessean, the man was described as, quote, a black man with a medium complexion and short hair, between 5'8" and 5'10", and weighing about 150 pounds. He was wearing black pants and a white shirt with a white vest-type design, end quote. He was also wearing a zodiac charm necklace. According to Detective Matthew Filter's notes, no leads were developed regarding the man who was seen with Leo Jane Doe. However, that necklace may be a clue. Though witnesses did not note the astrological sign on his charm, it was a match to hers in style, the same design. There is one possible tip that came in related to this man. Not long after the information about Leo Jane Doe's sighting was printed in the paper, a call came in to the Metro Nashville Police Department. The caller claimed that he knew the identity of the man who'd been seen with Leo Jane Doe. The caller referred to the man as her murderer. The caller said the man was, quote, dating the victim before her death, and that he was concerned that he would kill a friend of his, who the man was currently dating, but he did not know the identity of Leo Jane Doe, or he didn't offer it. Investigators did retain the information of this caller and the man he identified as a possible suspect, so that lead, while checked and cleared at the time, still can be re-explored. As the months passed in 1998, Leo Jane Doe's postmortem photo, and eventually original forensic art, were circulated farther outside of Tennessee. Combined with teletype messages sent to other departments in the region, and eventually the country, possible leads trickled in. In 1998, Metro Nashville PD had the means to develop a classic, or STR DNA profile for Leo Jane Doe. Combined with dental records taken at her recovery and the fingerprint records managed at her autopsy, they had full records for comparison. Most of the possibilities were quickly ruled out. One or two leads, though, seemed to hold promise. For instance, in October of 1990, Metro Nashville became aware of the case of a missing woman, Patricia Corley. At first, this seemed like a promising lead. According to MMPD files, a school friend of Patricia saw Leo Jane Doe's forensic art and called the station. She reported that her old high school friend, Trishie, matched the sketch. She had an August birthday, hazel eyes, and she was 5'2". What's more, Patricia had lost touch with her family in the early 1990s. Nashville was able to get a DNA sample from a close relative of Patricia for comparison, and soon they knew. Patricia was ruled out via STR DNA for comparison. Law enforcement followed up on several other reports. People who were reported to have been seen with women similar to Leo Jane Doe, or people who were seen with possible evidence of a crime, items like bloody clothing. But based on those reports, nothing was found. For the case, there was no path forward. The news coverage for Leo Jane Doe slowed after a few weeks, and then stopped altogether. That's almost always the case for the unidentified. When there's no family, no developing story, it's so difficult to keep them on the page. But her file stayed active. Within a year or so of the Doe Network database's establishment, updates began to appear between the Metro Nashville PD and Todd Matthews, one of its founders. Todd submitted a possible missing person as a match. A rule-out occurred via dentals or DNA or other information. The process was repeated. They kept trying. In 2014, a forensic artist produced new art for Leo Jane Doe's case that law enforcement considers to be extremely accurate. That has been shared widely since. It prominently features her Leo necklace. The first major improvement in the case, though, didn't come until Detective Matthew Filter took lead. In 2020, he received approval to pursue new DNA extraction from a blood sample retained in Leo Jane Doe's case. The extraction and sequencing were successful, and a SNP DNA profile was prepared for upload to GEDmatch. Since then, Detective Filter has worked with two separate investigative genetic genealogists to trace Leo Jane Doe's family and work toward finally identifying her. And while that hasn't happened yet, they have a big lead. Part of that lead has been shared with the media before, but the other aspect, the specifics, is coming to you for the first time on our show. In October 2020, WBRC News in Birmingham, Alabama, announced that Leo Jane Doe's family had been traced to Chilton County, Alabama. According to police records, neighboring counties are significant too, and Leo Jane Doe's family tree is deeply rooted in the area, both past and present. That much was made public, but what wasn't were the family names that appeared in Leo Jane Doe's tree. Metro Nashville approached those families, of course, but there were issues, namely determining who might be most closely related to Leo Jane Doe. A fifth cousin isn't likely to recognize a victim, but a second cousin might. Normally, this is not an issue, but some family trees are more complicated than others. We spoke to Detective Filter about his work on the IGG lead and the difficulties that arose.
In 2020, when through the genealogy research that was done, we were able to narrow down. She has strong ancestral roots in the Chilton County, Alabama area. So back in 2020, I actually did a TV interview with one of the local networks down there. And we also sent information to all the news outlets down there requesting that they put her picture in the paper and our information, so that if anybody recognized her or anybody had any somebody that's been missing or they hadn't seen in 25 years or so, to give us a call and that this might be their family member.
Did any leads come in from that?
No, not a one. The biggest thing with this case and the biggest lead that we have is the work that has been done by the genealogist so far that has targeted her ancestral roots in that Chilton County, Alabama area and the surrounding counties around there, including Coosa and Autauga counties. And I even, having called some people to ask if they would be willing to submit some DNA samples or upload samples for us to help us eliminate some of these family lines, there is a lot of intermarriage, and that is making it extremely difficult for the genealogist to narrow down any particular family. I had one that was working on it, and he's basically like, I can't do anything more unless we get some DNA samples, to try to eliminate and clear up some of these families. He says it's like looking at a spider web. He says you'll see like a 120, 130 centimorgan hit, but he says with all the intermarriage, he says it's probably not as close of a relationship as you would think it is, just because of that. I mean, I must have called like 100 people down there.
Wow.
And explained to them who I was, what I was doing, and asking them for help. And, some of them would talk to me, but they weren't really willing to upload DNA for one reason or another. Some didn't want anything to do with me. But I think it's just going to be a matter of waiting until there's some more DNA uploaded and they can start eliminating some of these family lines and narrowing the focus down a little bit better.
Detective Filter went on TV down in Chilton County to discuss the case, and Leo Jane Doe's forensic art was circulated, but it didn't lead to any answers. This was in late 2020, and they're still hoping that one genetic link that can identify her will appear. The issues Detective Filter mentioned are not unique. Endogamy, issues with finding testers, and narrowing the field of possible close relatives are problems that come up for all investigative genetic genealogists. So, we asked friend of the show Karen Binder from DNA Doe Project and Coast to Coast Genetic Genealogy Services to talk us through these problems in a bit more detail and to discuss possible solutions that could be looked at in such a case. To be clear, Karen and DDP did not work on the Leo Jane Doe case. Karen's just weighing in as an expert in the field on general issues. And, quick reminder, we are still helping DNA Doe Project raise money for the testing in the Florence Junction clandestine grave Jane Doe case. So please check the link in our show notes.
So, Karen, I know we've briefly talked about endogamy on the show before when we covered DNA Doe Project, but I'd like to get into it a little bit more so our audience can really understand how this affects investigative genetic genealogy. Detective Filter told us that this particular case has a lot of, quote, intermarriage. And obviously, he doesn't mean close familial marriage per se, but I'd love to explain this just a little bit more for our listeners. When a genealogist encounters endogamy in a family tree, what are they dealing with?
So endogamy can be described in a few different ways. And I'm going to give 3 different examples of different types of endogamy because it can really show up in diverse ways in the genetic matches of the subject that you're trying to identify. So the first example I'll give, which I think is probably what the detective is talking about in this case, is endogamy that is sort of regionally specific. So an example would be families from Appalachia. It's little small towns that are pretty isolated from the rest of the country. And so there's not a lot of selection when it comes to finding a life partner because there's a limited amount of people in the town that are going to be your age. So it's likely that you might share an ancestor with the person that you are going to have a baby with, because you're both from the same small town, and maybe your families have lived there for hundreds of years. So what that looks like in a person's family tree is what we call pedigree collapse. So for example, if you build out my family tree, my great-grandparents are from the same region of Ireland, and my great-grandparents were first cousins once removed to one another. So normally, if you're building out a person's pedigree, you're going to see that it gets larger over time. You have 2 parents and then 4 grandparents and then 8 great-grandparents, so on and so forth. It should double each generation. But what it looks like when you have pedigree collapse is that you have it collapse on one generation. Because, for example, my great-grandparents that are first cousins once removed to one another, they have a common ancestor. So rather than the family tree getting bigger on their line, it gets a little bit smaller because you have a common ancestor between 2 ancestors. So that's what pedigree collapse looks like. And this happens a lot in places that are rural areas, small towns, isolated areas. And also we think of it right now as, very scandalous to marry your second cousin, but, genetically it's not a bad thing if it happens, here and there. And it was definitely not uncommon in generations previous to our own. Most of us that are probably listening to this podcast probably couldn't name all of their second cousins. So it's not, the people that you grew up with in your household. It's a little bit more distant from you. So that's one example of endogamy. Another example of endogamy is what we call founder's effect. And that's where the founders of a town were prolific and, for example, in some regions of Texas or Mexico, there might be a set of brothers or a large family that founded a town. And most of the people that live in that town today, if you trace their family tree back far enough, it will go to the same family. So what you see in those endogamous populations is that there are a few last names that'll be found in everyone's family tree in that region. And then another example of endogamy, which I think is probably the most difficult to deal with as a genealogist, is when there's been a population that's isolated for many, many, many generations. So that would be, for example, the Jewish population. Ashkenazi Jewish people, if you look at their genetic matches, you'll see a lot of common small segments of DNA that have been passed down for not even just the last 100 or 200 years, but many, many hundreds of years, because this population has been isolated and sort of cut off from the general population for a really long time for a variety of different reasons. And so that makes the cases of Jewish unidentified decedents very, very difficult.
So when you get into the complexity of identification, can you talk about how endogamy slows you down when you're building out a family tree?
Sure. So in a case that is not impacted by endogamy, you're going to have a couple that is your subject's parents that you could call them the smoking gun couple, that there's no other couple in the world that could have produced this person that you're looking for. So for example, each of us has a unique circumstance of our own parents that it would be unlikely that somebody else could resemble our parents. Like my dad, his family is Irish from New Hampshire, and my mom's family is from Virginia, and they met in Indiana and they made me. There's not another family that's exactly like them. But in endogamous regions, so in some rural populations and some other regions that are impacted by endogamy, you might have, because you have that pedigree collapse situation where a lot of people in the same town have the same common ancestors, there are a lot of couples that might look like they could be the parents of the person that you're looking for. Maybe two brothers in a family married two sisters in a different family. And so either of them are equally likely to be the parents of the subject that you're looking for. So it just makes it harder to narrow down the right family, because there are a lot of families that look like they could be the right family.
And when you get to that point of not being able to narrow down, what do you do?
So in my cases, there are a few things that I would do when I hit endogamy. When I'm looking at a family, there are certain types of DNA that follow a specific inheritance pattern, and I would look at those to see if it can give me an additional clue. So one example of that is mitochondrial DNA, which is passed along the direct maternal line. So I have mitochondrial DNA haplogroup H1, and my mother has that same haplogroup, and her mother has that same haplogroup, and her mother has that same haplogroup. Everybody has the same haplogroup along their maternal line. However, a caveat to that is that a large amount of the same population will have the same mitochondrial DNA haplogroup. So if I have mitohaplogroup H1 and my best friend has H1, that doesn't mean that we're closely related to each other. But if I have H1 and she has A2G, then I know that we don't have a common maternal ancestor, because because we have two different haplogroups. So sometimes those mitochondrial DNA haplogroups can help you rule in or rule out a line based on what you're looking at. So let's say in this case that the doe has haplogroup H, and they're looking at a target family, and that haplogroup, the target family, you have a genetic match downline from them, and their haplogroup is B. Well, you know that it's not going to be the same direct maternal line for the subject, the doe, and the genetic match with haplogroup B because it's a different haplogroup. So you might be able to rule out some of the lines. Now, again, you can't really rule in a line because you can, because many people in the same population will have the same haplogroup, but you can fail to exclude certain lines. So that's one piece. I would be looking at the mitochondrial DNA haplogroup to see if that gives me any clues in relation to the genetic matches. Additionally, you can look at xDNA, which both biologic males and biologic females both have xDNA, but it follows certain inheritance patterns. And so it's a good clue to look at to see where a person got their xDNA from. So that can be a very helpful clue as well. Additionally, I will sort parent sides with DNA Painter, which can help to identify triangulation groups that might not have been found when you're sort of looking at an endogamous population. Sometimes those really endogamous matches drown out some smaller match network groups that can be identified by sorting parent sides. It's sort of a visual thing, so I can't really go into too much detail on that, but that's another thing that I would be trying if this were my case.
Thank you so much for that explanation. In this case, we know that a county in Alabama and that several family names have been narrowed down. And I know that Metro Nashville PD has reached out to those families asking them to test, but there has been some issues that have arisen. First, and I know that as a genealogist, you've probably run into this situation as well, but people have been reluctant to test. So what are some of the concerns you've heard about that? And what are some ways to perhaps tackle that?
It can be really hard to get people to take DNA tests and to upload to Family Tree DNA and GEDmatch, which are the databases that we use for investigative genetic genealogy. And some of the barriers that I've seen are, number one, privacy concerns. So people are very concerned about their genetic privacy. They are worried that insurance companies will have access to this information and exclude them for insurance based on health problems that they might have or might be at risk for. And I understand all of those concerns. I don't try to push people into DNA testing if that's their concern, because it's not helpful to push people to do it. It probably increases their distrust. So, but for every person that is unwilling to test, there are many more people that are willing to test or have tested. And you can share with them that they don't have to necessarily take a new DNA test. They can take their results from Ancestry or 23andMe and upload those to GEDmatch or Family Tree DNA. So that also helps with the financial barrier of testing. So oftentimes people don't want to take a test just because they don't have the finances to afford a DNA test. And so that can be overcome by the law enforcement agency paying for the test. Additionally, I've noticed personally, and this is purely anecdotal, that probably the highest rate that I get is Caucasian females, which are kind of, the interesting piece of that is that that's the same population that is usually into true crime stuff. You know, we've all seen the statistics for true crime podcast following and, attendance at events like CrimeCon. You know, we have to ask ourselves, what do we have going on in our society that people from minority populations might be hesitant to cooperate with the police and to test? And thankfully, you've covered a lot of those issues on your podcast. So I'm sure your listeners are familiar with that. So overcoming the issues where people are reluctant to test, number one is reaching out to people that have already tested, and the only thing that they need to do is sort of port over their results from one testing site to another. So that's my number one. People that are already interested in DNA testing and have already taken a test are going to be the ones that are most likely to help. Another is addressing their privacy concerns. So, for example, I've asked people, hey, would you upload to GEDmatch? I'll do a one-time comparison of your DNA to this John or Jane Doe, and then you can remove your test. And then that way they're not staying on the GEDmatch website. They're removing it, they're removing their data. And so sometimes people are willing to do that as well. So those are sort of my top 2 tips for cooperation. But in general, if they really don't want to test, I won't push it, because ultimately I want people to have trust of our field as investigative genetic genealogists, and pushing them won't get us any farther on that.
I think that's a really great point that I hadn't considered before, and that I'm going to start mentioning, the idea of encouraging people, if they're interested but perhaps hesitant, to upload for just one case, encouraging them to feel free to then delete their test.
Yeah, they can even mark their kit as research so that it's not even visible to anybody else in the database. So if I'm on the phone with them and they tell me, okay, I've uploaded, my kit number is blah, 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 and then I can go ahead and run the one-to-one right then, take a screenshot of it, and then they can remove their kit, never to be seen again.
Another thing I'd be interested in hearing about is when you come down to some names in a town, and this is a case where I know, for instance, when I've talked to Dr. Margaret Press of DNA Doe Project, one thing that is sometimes done is when you come to a town and you know that a victim is probably from that town or has relatives in that town, that forensic art might be circulated. And in this case, forensic art was circulated and no leads were developed, unfortunately, even though they do know some of the names of possible relations. How far back they go, we're not quite sure. Do you have any other techniques or ideas that you might use if you really have a town or county in your sights, in terms of this is where our match lies?
Absolutely. One that we tried on a couple of different cases at DNA Doe Project was targeted ads on Facebook. And the nice thing about those targeted social media ads is that you can get really specific. So if you know the specific township or the county that you think the person might come from, you can target that area. And people get pretty excited about seeing those ads, and they will share them to their own community. So not only are you targeting the region, but then also the people that see it are sharing it to that region as well. So for a very low ad spend, you could put out the new reconstruction, the surnames of interest, and the county or towns that the person might be from, and target that region and see if anybody comes forward with tips based on that. We've tried that on a couple of different cases, both of which are now at least tentatively resolved. And it didn't work for either one, but when we did get to the identity of the people that we were looking for, we found that the families that we were looking at, although we had targeted, a specific region, the family had actually moved out of that region. So we think that that's probably why the targeted ads didn't work for the cases that we tried it on, but I could definitely foresee that working in another case. So that's one sort of out of the box way to work on a case like this. And another would be to do targeted media outreach, get a hold of the media in that town, small town newspaper, small town website, news station, and get the image out there and share that information. People really get excited about it, and they want to be involved, and they're likely to share the story too.
And just generally speaking, when a case stalls like this, and I know from my friends that cases always stall, some cases do at least at some point, what are other ways that an investigative genetic genealogist might approach solving it?
Everybody has different methods, and this is why I'm so glad that we have a huge team at DNA Doe Project, because occasionally we'll get together and we'll tackle a case, and there will be somebody that Googles the right term or searches the obituary the right way. Just the way that they did something was a little bit different from the previous genetic genealogist that was working on it, and it breaks the case wide open. So to give you an example, I have a case that's been stalled for a really long time, and we had a little weekend get together recently of a team at DNA Doe Project, and somebody found an article that I had never seen that gave us some really key information about the location of a family member of this doe. I had never found it myself. The team that had been working on it never found this article. And we brought in another person and they searched just the right terms to find this article. So bringing in an outsider's perspective can be really helpful in breaking open a case that's a little bit stalled. And then the other things that I mentioned, looking at the mitochondrial DNA, Y DNA or X DNA might help. Also looking at separating parent sides or identifying genetic networks that were previously unidentified. And also taking a second look at the admixture or heritage report to see if maybe you're working with an underrepresented population that you're not seeing in your DNA matches because they're maybe not represented in GEDmatch, but maybe they're there, but you're just not seeing the matches.
And what would you do in that case?
So in that case, one case that I'll bring up is the Lyle Stevitt case. This is a pretty famous case. And initially, we had looked at the heritage report and we saw that he was partly Hispanic, Amerindian, it shows on GEDmatch. And what we didn't know until we actually found his identity is that he was half Peruvian. And the reason why we couldn't tell that at first is because Peruvians are really underrepresented in GEDmatch. So the much closer matches were people from the United States, and any Peruvian matches were way, 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 way down on the match list. We would have only found that out by separating parent sides, which is the piece that I talked about a little bit earlier. And that can really help to help you figure out if you're looking at an underrepresented population.
Thank you so much for these explanations. I really appreciate it.
Of course, anytime.
In Leo Jane Doe's case, Detective Filter has important information that can help to further narrow the search. The surnames of her relatives that the investigative genetic genealogist he worked with found during research. He's sharing those names here for the first time in hopes that our audience may recognize them and reach out to Metro Nashville PD for testing.
They were able to say that she is descended from a James Mims and a Faraba Reynolds, who are probably at least great-great-great-grandparents. That's as far back as he was able to connect a common ancestor. But the relatives of these ancestors are in the thousands. James Mims died in 1854 and Faraba Reynolds died in 1858. Trying to build that tree forward has been a real challenge with a lot of the intermarriage. But certainly anybody in that Chilton County, Alabama area, or Coosa or Autauga County, if their surname is either Easterling, Mims, or Minor, there's a very good chance that this lady is related to you in some way. And any help in trying to identify her would be appreciated.
And is that Mims, M-I-M-M-S?
M-I-M-S.
Easterling, Mims, and Minor. Those are the names to remember. Even if you don't live in Alabama now, your family may have roots there. So talk to your relatives and find out. If so, you could be key to resolving Leo Jane Doe's identity. And once her name is known, her murder investigation can truly begin. So, if you recognize these names, or if you have any information regarding the woman known as Leo Jane Doe or the Cumberland River Jane Doe, please contact Detective Filter at Metro Nashville Police at 615-862-7803. You can also call Nashville Crime Stoppers at 615-74-CRIME, that's 615-742-7463. Callers can remain anonymous and qualify for a cash reward. If you think you might be a DNA match, remember, you can request what Karen mentioned, having your test deleted after comparison. We have Leo Jane Doe's forensic art and other important details posted on our social media, so please check those accounts for more information. Thank you for listening. If you know a case that should be covered on the Fall Line, there's a link to our case submission form in the show notes. The Fall Line is an independently produced show, and we appreciate listener support. It allows us to do research, obtain FOIA, pay our content advisors, and support and donate to the causes we care about. If you try out the products we advertise, please use our sponsor codes. It really helps. And if you'd like to support the show and the stories we cover, join us on Patreon. We raise Patreon funds to continue to pay for the Millbrook Twins billboard and to fund therapy for families who've been on the show. Each and every one of our patrons helps us continue this work, and we're so grateful for your help. On Patreon, you get early release ad-free versions of our regular episodes for $5 a month. We also occasionally post other content, which all patrons can enjoy starting at just $1. If you prefer Apple Premium, we've begun that feed as well, so you have another way to contribute. The Fall Line is written, hosted, and researched by Laura Norton, with additional research by Brian Waters, Kiana Burgess, and Michaela Morrill. Interviews by Brooke Hargrove. Produced, engineered, and scored by Maura Curry. Content advisement by Brandy C. Williams, Liv Fallon, and Vic Kennedy. And as always, our most special thanks to Liz Lipka and Sarah Turney. As of November 2022, monthly donations are going to Season of Justice to support their testing and family grant initiatives.